So this first mini lecture, this first video for chapter 5 is going to focus on the first 10 pages, so 119 to 129. I want to talk generally just about what logos is, and then I want to talk about the role of probability uh, within a discussion of logical proofs, but really rhetoric generally. And then from there, I'd like to turn to deduction and induction, and finally the ethymeme. And I'll stop uh, on 129 at the bottom. After a discussion of the ethymeme, there is a turn to examples, and that'll be the beginning of the next video. So what is logos? Logos is the Greek word that we associate with logic and the adjective logical. Logos meant voice or speech in archaic Greek. Later it came to refer to reason, and it carries the sense in English in words such as logic. When someone says be logical, she means think things through, be rational. And we see the etymology of logos in the suffix for logi in words like ideology and psychology. In addition to these initial ways of understanding what logos is, logos, ethos, and pathos are three of the basic modes of appeal, or as Crowley and Hawkey are describing in the three modes of proof that rhetors will learn. As I said in the very first video, a lot of what you learn in rhetoric theory is learning how to support an argument, and logos, ethos, and pathos are a very important part of that. So logos, this chapter is focused in many ways on just how you use logos to support an argument. And then when we look at the next chapter, it'll be on how ethos is used, and then finally on pathos. Now, logos is obviously appeals to the logical, the rational, but I want to make clear that logos is not just connected to a kind of abstract, absolute sense of logic or rationality, to a kind of Spock-like rationality. It's also connected to a common sense logic that you find within a particular community, within a particular audience, and even one that is kind of constrained by a particular rhetorical situation in which they find themselves. So logos can be something relatively abstract and universal related to like rationality, but there are many kinds of rationality, and the rationality for one audience may be a little bit different from another based on their history, based on their general age groups, everything. So logos is something that can be kind of relative to an audience. Thinking about probability here, it's important to recognize that rhetoric is different from philosophy and science in that it's not looking for absolute truth. It is not looking to establish truths that are going to stand up over the tests of time and place. Rhetoric is focused on persuasive communication for a particular audience and a particular time and place, for the situations in which an audience finds itself. And those truths, because they're going to be based on probable beliefs that are the basis for common sense reasoning within that audience, will most likely change over time. Looking at deduction and induction here, starting on page, let's see, on page 122, Let's talk about two ways of reasoning, deduction and induction, that are the basis for different strategies in rhetorical persuasion. So deduction is connected to the Latin word meaning to lead down, whereas induction is connected to the idea of to lead into. I'm not sure that I find those associations, deduction, induction, with those phrasings very useful. In some ways, I feel like they're kind of the same thing because you can lead down into something. So, for what it's worth, another way that I find useful to kind of contrast deduction and induction is to think of deduction as reasoning from the inside out and induction as reasoning from the outside in. And what that means is that deduction is reasoning that begins with premises and beliefs that you already have that you use as the basis for understanding something that's happening in the world around you, that you use as a basis for understanding particulars. And so it's reasoning from the inside, from beliefs that are already established to particulars, whereas induction is reasoning from particulars to a general statement. So, from a series of particulars in the world around you, you induce a pattern, and that is the basis for a general belief. So, deduction and induction are two processes for thinking through issues in a manner that would be associated with logos. Now, for Aristotle, deductive reasoning was connected to syllogismos, or the syllogism, and Crowley and Hawkey offer you a breakdown of what a syllogism is. There's a lot that can be said about syllogisms. There are all different kinds. This is a very basic discussion here. Um, let's take a look at this example of a syllogism. Um, the most famous example of this sort of reasoning goes as follows. All people are mortal. Socrates is a person, therefore Socrates is mortal. The first statement is a general premise associated by everyone. This premise is general because it makes an observation about an entire class, all people. In syllogisms, set up like the example about Socrates, the first general premise is called the major premise. The second statement is a particular premise accepted by everyone. This premise is particular because it refers to only one person out of the class of people. And this premise is called the minor premise. And then the last statement is the conclusion. So what we see in syllogistic reasoning is a working from generalization to particular. And the generalization would be that all people are mortal. We can assume that of all the people that exist, mortality is a basic characteristic of that class universally. And then if we establish that Socrates is a person, i.e., Socrates is part of the class people, and we can establish that logically through syllogistic reasoning by working from general to particular, then we can make the logical and absolutely true statement that Socrates is mortal. That would be syllogistic reasoning. And what I understand is that for the ancient Greeks, for students of philosophy, um, to work through the establishment of a truth, students would develop chains upon chains, like links in a chain, just long chains of syllogisms like this, one connected to the next, major to minor, minor to major, over and over to establish one particular truth. This is the basis for, strict, airtight, logical thinking. But this is not something that's going to work for your average audience, for a public audience. The human experience is, among other things, constrained by patience, constrained by a certain amount of time, in which you have a window to work as a rhetor to move an audience through language toward a new way of thinking and feeling. And so rhetoricians tended to work with a more condensed or truncated version of the syllogism, which is known as the enthymeme. Okay, so whereas philosophers worked with the syllogism, according to Aristotle, as a basic way to kind of work through um, deductive forms of truth. For the rhetorician, the work was done in what's known as the enthymeme. And so the enthymeme is basically just a shortened or truncated version of syllogistic reasoning. It is one that's based uh, more so on probability and community belief. Rhetors ordinarily use some widely held community belief as the major premise of their arguments. So here we can already see a form of deductive reasoning that's going to be based more on probability, which wouldn't have made the philosophers happy. They then apply that premise to the particular case in which they are interested. So, um, what you find in a rhetorical context is an approach to deductive reasoning that is designed to appeal to the commonplace probabilities that define that community's sense of reality, and to work from those to particulars that could be the basis for a moving conclusion that could support a conclusion in a way that would appeal to that audience and move them toward new forms of thinking and feeling and acting. Um, I had mentioned deduction as a way of reasoning from the inside out, or as it's brought up by Crowley and Hawkey, as reasoning um, that kind of leads down, and it is reasoning related to the syllogism and the enthymeme that works from the general to the particular. With inductive reasoning, we see kind of the opposite movement. We move from the particular to the general. And so Aristotle recognized on page 124 another movement between premises, and he defined it as the progress from particulars to universals. And so later logicians called this movement induction, in Latin inducere, to lead into. Induction leads away from particulars and into a general conclusion. So let's take a look at this example here. Aristotle supplied this example of inductive reasoning. If the skilled pilot is the best pilot, and if the skilled charioteer the best charioteer, then the skilled person is the best person in any particular sphere. Now, I hope you recognize that, yeah, okay, that may be generally true that a skilled pilot is the best, and, let's pull out another kind of pilot, the charioteer. That one, makes sense too. But to leap to the conclusion then that the skilled person is the best person, for a philosopher, you may need more examples to challenge the universal premise, to kind of work through things. But for a rhetor working within a constraint of time with an audience, and working from the probabilities that they would have agreed with in the first place, this is going to be good enough. It's going to be persuasive. So I am going to stop there, and in the next video I will talk about about examples, maxims, proverbs, and more.